All right. So we are obviously moving very quickly through large segments of time. So I'm trying to hit the main points. And I'm gathering those points under a sort of common idea here, which is, looking at the diversity of culture, popular culture in the United States in a time that is before mass media, or as mass media is starting to dawn. You've got film as a form of mass media, which is within this time period. So we've got silent pictures coming along in 1911 or 1912 approximately. But by and large, America is a collection of a lot of very diverse communities. And the idea of marketing popular culture is has to confront that diversity in some way. And so that's the way that they choose to do that, I'm calling mainstreaming. So we'll remember that from the last presentation. And mainstreaming is an operation that takes, authentic art forms that belong to specific groups of people who have a shared lived experience. And it operates on that art form and usually evacuates a lot of the very specific details that anchors that art form to that community, that references to specific events, that this very specific details about what that lived experience is, and it kind of dumbs it down, simplifies it, and that's called codification, right? So you're making something similar and a sort of generalized form or version of it. And so it's that process that I find really interesting when looking at the history of popular music. So we'll be talking about that today. So once again, we're talking about a collection of diverse communities, some with, having immigrated from Europe or having been brought over against their will from Africa, or immigrated from the Orient, newly arrived versus, here since the time of the Pilgrims, still relatively young compared to a lot of other societies. And so there's a lot of dividing lines, right? So urban cities versus country living, urban versus rural, white versus non-white, and perhaps the most important of all would be, the poverty line. So who's above and below that? And so it's the job of popular culture industry, right, business, to actually make a profit off of art that is created and distributed to all of these people, to cross those boundaries. And so translators are those who can effectively cross those boundaries, and translators, or those who can effectively cross those boundaries, are also successful. That's a trait for success in the music business. And so some of those translators from this time period would be J.P. Sousa, who kind of had the brass band that was very famous in the late 1800s, early 1900s, doing marches and influenced by polka music, very popular form of music. So that's one example of a translator from the time period. Charles Harris was not a musically literate dude. Wrote, kind of one of these front porch guitar picker kind of fellows who happened to write the first million seller in the music business, a song called After the Ball. But he knew enough about the process to realize that he needed people who could help him translate that from his front porch all the way out to popular acceptance during that day. And there are very specific vehicles that he used, so we'll get into those. W.C. Handy, St. Louis Blues, was his famous composition from the 1910s. This is an African-American gentleman who was musically literate, but was taking, he was translating musical ideas that came from people who were, not only musically illiterate, but, could neither read nor write. And so the fact of his literacy and his musical sensibility and genius, if you will, allowed him to translate those ideas, to take them from one community that, because they were illiterate, would not have access to mass distribution, and then turn those ideas into a form that would be available for mass distribution. And that was for him as simple as the ability to write music and to compose music. Vernon and Irene Castle, as well as James Europe, you're looking at a situation in New York City where you've got another very literate and well-versed black band leader who teamed up with a kind of duo, a husband and wife team in New York City, who were more on the high society side, and they trained people how to dance the latest dances, and so they were huge at this time. So we'll start there. So James Europe, formerly trained violinist, there he is there on the right, old picture, like everything is at this point in time. The very first to unionize black musicians. So this is a pretty significant idea here. So taking black musicians from across the country who make it to the Big Apple and providing a home for them and of course the union idea is that he's going to be arguing for a fair wage and fair treatment, fair working hours, so it's all about the rights of the employee. You've got the employee usually at the losing end of a lot of power struggles between corporations. Now add black employee into that, equation. And so you can see the need for a union for black musicians is even greater. Introduction of African-American popular music to France. So he's a World War I veteran. And so he has this sort of international sophistication about him as well that makes him a very unique character, and I would say very powerful in terms of his influence. Sometimes credited with the invention of the jazz ensemble. So you look over here to the right, you can see things like, drums, guitar, horns, things that became part of what would be, a jazz ensemble: piano, bass, horn, guitar, a jazz band. And here is the couple that he ended up partnering with, the Castles, right? So Vernon and Irene Castle basically created a social dance empire. So if you wanted to know how to do the latest dance craze, and you had the money to pay for it, they would train you how to do it. So they set up in the top floor of this kind of luxurious hotel, the Castle House, right? A New York City dance salon. And they chose Europe, right? So he brought his 11-piece orchestra in. They had a residency there, and they helped turn all of the hoi polloi, right, into foxtrot dancers, turkey trot dancers, doing the one step, the castle walk, like all of the dances of the day that turned the Roaring '20s into the party that it was, passed through this. And so what's interesting about the Castles was that, she was rejected as a sort of high culture stage dancer. And so she turned then to this kind of alternative route for her success, which would be not high culture, right? It was more of a low culture, popular culture approach. Her husband took these dance moves in and simplified them, right? That simplification part is very crucial for making something popular, to mainstream it, right? It's got to be simple enough for people to not get lost in the details. And so he reduced 160 possible tango moves down to 6 essential steps. Europe also simplified the way that this music could interact. And so they had a pretty powerful way to mainstream these dance steps. And so where were they getting the steps from? Interestingly enough, the vaudeville um, shows of the day, which were traveling sort of multi format shows. So you'd have storytellers, gymnasts, acrobats, singers, and then dance groups. These dance groups would travel around the country and observe as they got the crowd whipped up into a frenzy what these different little communities, what kind of dances they were doing. And so they were able to sponge up, part of the translation process, they were sponging up these influences from these little communities that nobody knew about, that had no, real national presence, and then take those and incorporate them into their own acts. And so they were translating from the grassroots level into New York City. And now you've got Vernon and Irene Castle and James Europe, kind of condensing that into these simplified versions, right? Codifying these new ideas into a format that was easy to ingest, right, for the national audience. And so they are part of this low to high mainstreaming process. Mainstreaming the blues. Okay, so the 12 bar form that has become known, for blues music, which is basically a 3-chord 12 bar blues. I think I can play a little bit of it for you here on a piano. Here we are in the key of G. And so you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, C. 1, 2, 3. That's 8 bars. And then the turnaround. And then it all starts over. Okay, the 12 bar blues form was something that, had to be realized by somebody. So there you've got W.C. Handy on the right-hand side playing, imagine he was just playing what I was, but actually writing it down, perhaps even for the first time. You've got your Vocalion, OK, Paramount, Columbia, Pace. These are all your race record companies, in contrast with Black Swan Records, which was the first black-owned record company that was distributing, recording black artists, distributing to black artists. So that's 1921, surprisingly early there. We talked about Handy working as a cultural translator, getting music from communities that were largely illiterate and into circulation. And so, the famous discovery story that's associated with him was, he's in a train station, a train depot in Memphis, and there's a guy, in rags, obviously very, very poor. He's got a guitar playing, quote, the strangest music anybody's ever heard. And he got back, to St. Louis and wrote down what he remembered hearing. So, there he is doing the same thing as those dance troupes, sponging in, right, that strange new musical influence, and then doing his part along the chain of mainstreaming, right? Repackaging it and distributing it in a way that would be interesting to the folks, to the mainstream. Jimmy Blythe here down at the bottom right was the first one to actually codify the 12 bar form that I played. W.C. Handy is associated with, being the father of the blues, but that actual 12 bar form is actually associated with Jimmy Blythe, right? So there's a few musical terms, the arpeggiated triad with the 6 dominant, with adding the natural 6 and going to the dominant 7. So that sounds like this. So here's the triad, C chord. When you arpeggiate it, you do every one of those. So when you go, right? So then you add 6, and then the dominant 7. So that's the boogie. Okay, so that is associated with this cat, Jimmy Blythe. There's a recording, little speaker here you can play and listen to that. But it's a very similar thing of the W.C. Handy story, taking an influence that he heard and then putting it down in a way that others could enjoy. So these two have their legacy, but the spotlight and the fame for blues music in the 1920s was on the women for sure. Mamie Smith in particular, you'll see her in a different presentation, but her Crazy Blues was really the one that kicked the door open. But these women here, you've got Bessie Smith, Alberta Hunter in the middle, and Ethel Waters. They didn't just happen to have an idea that got picked up and then passed into a white-owned record company for huge success. They were enjoying that success themselves, right? So Bessie Smith made it onto movies. Ethel Waters made it onto Broadway. And so we see the women leading the way in terms of success, meaningful success, not just for themselves and their families, but also other, members of their community who saw them on film and had something to recognize and look up to in terms of potential of their own lives. So, those are some of the recordings that are associated. Sorry, I've got to plug my computer in. All right. Some of the recordings, number one Race Records hit, Bessie Smith, Downhearted Blues. I do invite you to just, take some time. You should be using an hour to 2 hours a day for this class. Just enjoy some of this music now that I'm giving you the context, and you can understand more about why it's important and the sort of triumphant nature, especially of these blues divas music. When you listen to the recordings now, they maybe won't sound quite so foreign and unusual. Alberta Hunter toured Europe in 1917, so it's World War I era. And so once again, spreading the brand of this particular genre of music and also of the community that's associated to it, not just within her hometown, regionally, or even nationally, over film and radio, but also, radio wasn't around quite yet until 20, but having an international presence. So she's kind of like the Black Jenny Lind, but going from America to Europe. Okay, we talked a little bit about Charles Harris. The first million seller in the United States, it was After the Ball. Over 1 million records, which were cylinders by 1893, 78 RPM, so the platters by 1898. 5 million copies in sheet music. And so here's his strategy of mainstreaming. Charles K. Harris is who it is. Those are his years. So he was dead by 1930. Didn't live too terribly long. I guess it made it into his 60s. Self-taught banjo player who chose a very highly danceable rhythm for the song, danceable for that day at least. He himself was not musically literate, but he knew who to get involved, right? So he first of all got a professional musician and he dictated the song to the musician. And then he paid for the song to be placed so the musician then translated it into writing, but then he paid for the song to be placed into one of these traveling musical shows of the day, vaudeville shows. And so now he's got the song in a form that can be separated from him, right? He doesn't have to be there playing it for anybody else to understand it. That's the first move, and now he's got it in a distribution network. And so, low to high mainstreaming. Untrained writer dictates to a writer, to actual, notation writer, receives sheet music, which would be the lead sheet, pays to place the song in a theatrical show, which is that's the promotional vehicle. The popularity gains the attention of a music publisher, which is the Whitmark Company, as well as John Philip Sousa, who once again is the brass band star of the day. Whitmark offers him a publishing deal, which he declines, ends up self-publishing and gains publishing royalties of $25,000 a month, in 1900 money, which is about the value of $750,000 a month today. Charles K. Harris, you done good. J.P. Sousa, there he is. Okay, so the Sousa March, right? So this is kind of like polka music, a lot of waltzes. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 type of dance music. Band leader for the Marine Band. So he was, as you can see, him dressed up there in his Marine outfit. He's got a couple medals there, nice hat. He's got the John Lennon glasses going. I mean, this guy knows what's up. So it was America's supergroup of the day, turn of the century there. America's Marching King, Stars and Stripes Forever. You know, he's got songs that you still hear today. Only about 24 or so phonograph recordings, about the same amount as somebody like Robert Johnson, you know, in the 20s. So not a ton of different recordings, but they were very, very important. So he was able to tie nationalist expression, so our national identity, to popular music. So he's using his position as a military man as a form of branding, but also internal distribution, right? So if you look at the Union Army, if the Army, you know, grabs onto a song that you're playing that you've written as one that is, you know, patriotic enough or good enough for them to use, now you're looking at, you know, 9,000 different players and 500 different brass bands that are distributing, right, the music locally, regionally, nationally, internationally. And so the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, were, you know, during the time frame of his life, and so he understood the sort of power of nationalist identity and especially music within that for, you know, giving a sense of national pride as you sing along or, you know, hear a certain melody. You know, this is kind of his one of his contributions to the American popular music scene. So he was smart in that as a translator, he's not only using that internal community, so the federal sort of military system, as a way to not only brand, but have a sort of global distribution. But he's also, when he's playing, he's not just doing the marches and the waltzes. He's also doing, you know, cakewalk music, which is associated with vaudeville, especially the minstrel side. So he's reaching out to African American, you know, stereotyped, unfortunately, but that sort of community polka music. So we've got, you know, associated with German immigrants, waltz associated with other Western European immigrants. So it's a fair sort of ability to adapt to, you know, classical music to a more modern sound, if you will. Once again, the brass bands were prominent between 1860 and 1910, and they sort of tie the minstrel show era to the start of vaudeville, which came about in the, you know, 1915s, 1920s. Minstrel shows dying out, you know, around that time. Late 1800s, I would say. And the brass bands, especially in the hands of Sousa, reflect the kind of popular culture, the melting pot. So he's able to reach out to a lot of different communities and appeal to their immigrants. So you can see these different dance styles: waltz, polka, cotillion, and grand ball. Formal dance styles translated and coupled to less formal rural dances. And so here's a really good example of him standing with one foot in high culture, one foot in low culture, and operating as a translator across those two boundary lines. And there he is with his band. Sousa and the Marine Band, circa 1900. All right, a lot of loud instruments there. It's a brass band. So this is the kind of a band you want to have, you know, if not on the battlefield or, competing with the sound, how loud battle is, which is, I think, why those instruments in particular are associated with the military. Definitely to have in your parade. So you've got a lot of people, no sound amplification. You get a brass band out there. They're going to be heard with, that many musicians. So what have you got? Quite a few. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, about 40 or 50 musicians there. And of course, you've got, the Marine Band brand as one of the German harmonica manufacturer, Hohner, has chosen the Marine Band. And so the name, you can see, is promoted, propagated via music products. All right, folks. Well, that's the end of this one. We will continue looking into our time period as we move closer to the magical year of 1940 and 50, which is when you guys are going to start sharing your presentations. Thank you.